There are some mysteries that feel incomplete, not because they lack evidence, but because the evidence that does exist refuses to make sense. This is one of those cases, a case where 5 men drove into the mountains and never came back. At first, it looked simple, a wrong turn, a breakdown, a tragic mistake in the cold. But the deeper you go, the less it behaves like an accident, and the more it begins to feel like something else entirely. Because this wasn't just a disappearance, it was a sequence of decisions that no one could explain. Choices that defied logic, movements that led deeper into danger instead of away from it. And when they were finally found, what remained told a story far more disturbing than anyone expected. 5 men, 1 car, a mountain road, and a trail that ends in something deeply unnatural. Before the cold, before the confusion, before the fear, there were just 5 friends. They were not adventurers, not thrill seekers, not the kind of people who chased danger. They were ordinary, quiet, structured, the kind of men who lived predictable lives and found comfort in routine. Some of them had intellectual disabilities, nothing severe enough to prevent independence, but enough that their families kept a close, protective watch. They followed schedules. They avoided risk. They stayed within boundaries. And that is what makes what happened next so difficult to understand. It was late February, 1978. Winter had settled in fully. The mountains were covered in deep, unforgiving snow, the kind that muffles sound and erases footprints. On the evening of February 24th, the 5 men attended a college basketball game. A simple outing, a normal night. They cheered, they laughed, they sat among hundreds of others, completely unremarkable. No one noticed anything strange. No one saw fear. No one saw hesitation. Just 5 men enjoying a game. After the game, they left. They had plans for the next day. Important plans. One of them was scheduled to play in a basketball tournament, and he was excited, prepared, ready, which means one thing. They intended to come home. Back at their homes, everything was ready. Clothes laid out, alarms set, families expecting them. There was no indication, not even the smallest hint, that something was about to go wrong. But they never made it back. Sometime after leaving the game, they began driving, not toward home, but away from it, far away, into terrain they didn't know, into conditions they weren't prepared for, into a place that would soon become a dead end. And here's where the first fracture appears, because none of them had any reason to go there. No family, no friends, no plans, no explanation. The road they chose wasn't a shortcut. It wasn't convenient. It wasn't even safe. It climbed higher, deeper into the mountains, where snow piled thick and roads became unreliable. This wasn't just a wrong turn. It was a sustained decision, a continuous movement in the wrong direction. And yet, they kept going. At some point, the car stopped. Not because it ran out of gas, not because it broke down. It was still functional, still capable of driving, but it was abandoned, and that's where the nightmare begins. Because 5 men in freezing temperatures, miles from help, left behind a working vehicle and stepped out into the dark. No clear path, no proper gear, no reason to continue. And they walked one step, then another, into the cold, into the silence, into something that would leave investigators and families and an entire country asking the same question for decades. Why? Why would they leave safety behind? Why move deeper into danger? Why ignore everything that should have told them to turn back? Because whatever happened that night, it didn't start in the mountains. It started before that, in the car, in their decisions, in something unseen that changed the direction of 5 lives in a single night. And maybe, just maybe, it followed them. As the hours passed, temperatures dropped. Visibility disappeared. The world around them turned into a blank, frozen void. And somewhere in that darkness, something went very, very wrong. Because this is not just a story about getting lost. It's a story about behavior that defies survival, about choices that make no sense, about evidence that feels almost staged. And the deeper you go, the less human it starts to feel. Doors closed, windows intact, no signs of struggle, no urgency, just silence. And beyond that car, a trail that leads away from logic, away from safety, away from everything they knew, and into a mystery that has never been solved. Next, we follow that trail, step by step, decision by decision, until the moment everything stops making sense. The timeline begins with something deceptively simple: a drive home. February 24th, 1970. Late evening. The game had ended. The crowd dispersed, and the 5 men got back into their car. They should have taken a familiar route, one they knew, one that would have brought them safely back within a few hours. But they didn't. Instead, the car begins to move in another direction, subtle at first, a turn that doesn't immediately seem wrong. But then another and another. The distance between them and home begins to grow. At some point, they leave the main roads, the kind that stay maintained, the kind that stay lit, and they enter a place where help becomes unlikely. No gas stations, no traffic, no easy way back. The road begins to climb. Higher, colder, more isolated. And still, they keep going. There are no confirmed sightings during this stretch, no witnesses, no clear reason, just the assumption that something guided them there. At some point in the night, they reach a remote mountain road near the Plumas National Forest, a place that, in winter, becomes hostile. Snow deepens, traction weakens, the road narrows, and then The car stops. No crash, no visible damage, no signs of mechanical failure. It simply stops. And this moment is where everything begins to fracture. Because what happens next is not a reaction. It's a decision. One by one, they leave the vehicle. No one stays behind. No one waits. No one attempts to fix anything because nothing is broken. They just walk into the darkness. This is where the timeline becomes something else. Not just unclear, but deeply unnatural. Because survival instinct should have taken over here. Stay with the car, run the engine, wait for daylight. But they did the opposite. They left warmth behind. They left shelter behind. They left the only thing that could have saved them behind. And they walked into terrain that only got worse. Deeper snow, steeper ground, thicker forest, and still no sign of hesitation. The footprints tell a strange story. They were not running, not scattered, not chaotic. They moved together in a line, deliberate, controlled, as if they weren't fleeing something, but following something. The trail continues for miles, not meters, miles, through freezing conditions, without proper clothing, without supplies. And yet, they kept going. At some point, one of them begins to fall behind. The spacing changes. The rhythm breaks. Something is happening. Fatigue, cold, confusion, or something else entirely. But the group doesn't turn back. They don't stop. They continue forward. And that's what makes this timeline so difficult to accept, because every step takes them further from survival, further from logic, further from anything that resembles a rational choice. Hours pass, possibly longer, and then something appears. A structure, a Forest Service trailer, remote, locked, but intact. Inside, there is food, blankets, supplies, everything they would need to survive. But the timeline here becomes even more disturbing because not all of them make it. Somewhere along the way, the group fractures, not all at once, not violently, but gradually. One stays behind, then another, and eventually only some reach the trailer. And when they do, they enter. But not in the way you'd expect. They don't break windows. They don't force entry in panic. They find a way in, slowly, as if urgency isn't fully there. Inside, there is everything. Military rations, fuel, beds, enough to last for months. But what they use and what they ignore creates a timeline that investigators would later struggle to explain, because they survive for a while, days, possibly weeks. Time passes inside that trailer, but outside, the trail goes cold. The snow continues to fall, erasing evidence, silencing movement, and whatever happened in those final hours becomes locked inside that frozen landscape. Back at the car, nothing changes. It remains where it was left, untouched, waiting, and for days, no one knows. Families wait, expecting them to come home, but they don't, and as time stretches, concern turns into fear, because this wasn't like them. Not to disappear, not to wander, not to break routine. Something had interrupted that pattern, something powerful enough to redirect 5 lives into the mountains. The timeline gives us movement, distance, sequence, but it doesn't give us meaning. It shows us what they did, but not why. And that question will only grow more disturbing as the evidence begins to surface, because the path they took was only the beginning. What they left behind tells a far darker story. Next, the evidence, the kind that doesn't just confuse, but contradicts everything we think we understand. The timeline tells us what happened, but the evidence tells us something far more unsettling, because when investigators finally reached the car, it wasn't what they expected. It wasn't wrecked. It wasn't buried. It wasn't even stuck beyond recovery. It was operational. The battery worked. The fuel was there. There was no mechanical failure, and yet it had been left behind. Even more strange, the car wasn't trapped in deep snow. Investigators noted something unsettling. The vehicle could have been driven out, meaning whatever caused them to stop wasn't the environment. It was something else. Inside the car, everything looked normal. No signs of panic, no struggle, no damage, just belongings left behind. Jackets, personal items, things they would have needed to survive outside. And that's where the first contradiction appears, because they didn't take what they needed. They stepped into freezing conditions, unprepared. And then there were the footprints. At first glance, they seem ordinary. 5 sets, moving away from the car. But the more closely they were examined, the more unnatural they became. They weren't scattered. They weren't erratic. They didn't show signs of panic. They were aligned, almost as if the group was moving with purpose, step after step, in a line. No one breaking away, no one running, no indication that they believed they were in immediate danger. And yet, every step took them further from survival, further from warmth, further from safety. There were no return tracks, no hesitation, no second thoughts, just a single direction, forward. And then the trail changes, subtle at first, but noticeable. The spacing shifts, the rhythm breaks. Something begins to happen, fatigue or disorientation, or something influencing them in ways we don't fully understand. And then the trail splits, not dramatically, not in panic, but enough to suggest they were no longer unified. And this is where the evidence begins to contradict itself, because even as they separate, there's still no sign of urgency, no running, no collapse of order, just divergence, as if each decision was being made in slow motion. And then the trailer, this structure, should have changed everything. Inside, there was survival, food, shelter, warmth. But what investigators found inside raised more questions than answers. First, the food. There was enough to sustain multiple people for a long time. Military rations, canned goods, even a supply of dehydrated meals. But most of it was untouched. They were starving, freezing, desperate, and yet they didn't use what was available. Not fully. Some food was eaten, but not nearly enough. Not in a way that matched survival instinct. Then, the bedding. One of the beds had been used carefully, as if someone had stayed there for an extended period, wrapped in blankets, protected from the cold. And for a moment, it almost feels logical until you notice what's missing. No fire had been started, no proper attempt to generate heat, despite the presence of materials that could have made it possible. There was even a heating system, but it wasn't used. And then, the most disturbing detail, one of the men had survived longer than the others. Days, possibly weeks. His body showed signs of prolonged survival. He had eaten. He had stayed in bed. He had remained alive, while the others did not, which raises a question that no one has been able to answer. Why didn't he leave? Why stay in a place that offered survival, but no escape? Why not search for help? Why not use the resources available to their full extent? And perhaps the most haunting detail of all, time. Because the timeline suggests that at least one of them lived far longer than expected, long enough to think, to plan, to act, and yet the actions taken never fully align with survival. It's as if something interrupted their ability to reason. Not completely, but enough to alter their decisions. Not panic, not chaos. Something quieter, something slower, something that guided them just enough to lead them away from safety. And whatever it was, it didn't leave a clear trace. No signs of another person, no evidence of force, just contradictions everywhere. A working car, abandoned, supplies ignored, shelter underused, a path that only moves forward, and decisions that feel almost incomplete. This is the evidence. Not broken, not missing, but impossible, because it doesn't tell a single story. It tells many, and none of them fully make sense. Next, the search and what they found scattered across the mountains, piece by piece, because the truth wasn't waiting in one place. It was spread out, broken, and far more disturbing than anyone expected. For days, nothing happened. No calls, no sightings, no sign of anything wrong. Back home, the silence began to stretch. Families waited, at first patiently, then uneasily, because this wasn't normal. These were men who followed routines, who checked in, who didn't just disappear. And when they didn't return the next day, something shifted. Concern became alarm. Authorities were notified. Search efforts began. At first, small, localized. But as hours turned into days, the scale grew. Volunteers, police, rescue teams, all moving into the mountains, trying to find 5 men who should never have been there. And almost immediately, the conditions worked against them. Heavy snow, freezing temperatures, terrain that swallowed tracks and erased direction. Every hour that passed reduced the chances of survival, and still there was no sign until they found the car. It had been sitting there the entire time, quiet, still. When searchers reached it, they immediately knew something was wrong, not because of damage, but because of what wasn't there. No bodies, no clear tracks nearby, no immediate explanation, just a car left behind on a road that led nowhere. The discovery shifted everything. The search area expanded outward. From that point, into the wilderness, search teams began following what little evidence remained. Faint impressions in the snow, partial trails, anything that could suggest direction. And slowly, a path began to form. It led away from the car exactly as the evidence had suggested, deeper into the mountains. The teams followed it as far as they could, but the snow had done its work. Much of the trail was gone, erased, and so the search became something else. Not a rescue, but a recovery. The first discovery came weeks later, not near the car, not even close, miles away. A body in the snow. He had not made it far. The cold had taken him early, and what surrounded him only deepened the mystery. There were no signs of violence, no struggle, just exposure. But even in death, something felt wrong because of where he was found and how far he had traveled without proper clothing. Then another and another. The bodies were not together. They were scattered, separated by distance, as if the group had dissolved, piece by piece. Each discovery added information, but removed certainty because the pattern didn't make sense. Some had died early, others had gone further, and then the search teams reached the trailer. At first glance, it looked untouched, quiet, still. But inside was where the reality of what happened began to settle in. The air inside was heavy, stale, frozen in time. And then they saw him, one of the 5 men lying in the bed, carefully wrapped in blankets, as if someone had tried to keep him alive, or as if he had tried to keep himself alive. His condition told a different story. Not immediate death, but survival. For days, possibly weeks, around him, evidence of time passing. Food consumed, small adjustments made, but not enough, never enough. And then, the details that made investigators pause. The supplies, still there. The heater, unused. The materials for fire, ignored. It was as if survival had been attempted, but only partially. As if something had interrupted the process, or limited it. And outside the trailer, the rest of the story waited. More bodies discovered over time, some closer, some farther, each one adding to the same conclusion, and yet contradicting it, because none of them told a complete story. Some had succumbed to the cold quickly. Others had moved farther than expected. One had survived longer, in conditions that should have ended him sooner, and none of them left behind an explanation. The search teams documented everything. Distances, positions, conditions, trying to reconstruct the final moments, trying to understand what had happened out there. But every attempt led to the same place: confusion, because the evidence didn't align. Not cleanly, not logically. It suggested movement, but not motive. It showed survival, but not strategy. It revealed time passing, but not decisions that made sense. And as the search came to an end, the mountain returned to silence. Snow continued to fall, covering what remained, erasing what little clarity there was. The 5 men had been found, but the answers had not. What happened in those mountains was no longer a question of where or when, but why. Why leave the car? Why walk into the cold? Why ignore the very things that could have saved them? And perhaps most disturbing of all, were they alone? Next, the theories, the attempts to explain what refuses to be explained, from the rational to the unthinkable. When a mystery refuses to resolve, the human mind does something predictable. It begins to build explanations, some grounded in logic, others drifting into something darker. Because the truth is, this case doesn't lack theories. It has too many, and each one solves part of the puzzle while breaking another. The first theory is the simplest. They got lost, a wrong turn, a navigational error. They drove into unfamiliar territory, became disoriented, and made a series of bad decisions. It happens. People panic. They misjudge distance. They underestimate the cold. And at first, this explanation seems enough until you look closer, because they didn't just get lost. They drove far beyond any reasonable mistake, past clear points of correction, past areas where they could have turned back. This wasn't a momentary error. It was sustained. And even if they were lost, that doesn't explain the next decision, leaving the car. No rational survival instinct would lead 5 men to abandon a working vehicle in freezing conditions, not without a compelling reason. And that's where the second theory emerges. disorientation, specifically hypothermia-induced confusion. As the body loses heat, the mind begins to fail. Judgment weakens, perception distorts. Victims may remove clothing, walk in the wrong direction, or behave irrationally. It's called paradoxical undressing, terminal burrowing, documented, real, and it explains some things: the poor decisions, the continued movement into danger. But again, only partially, because hypothermia doesn't begin instantly. It develops over time, which means the initial decision to leave the car still lacks explanation. Something had to trigger it, something that made them believe the car was no longer safe. And that leads to the next theory: a perceived threat, something that frightened them, not necessarily real, but real enough in their minds. It could have been anything: a sound, a shadow, a misunderstanding. In the dark, in isolation, even the smallest anomaly can become something overwhelming. And if one of them panicked, the others might have followed. Group behavior, trust, a shared decision based on a single moment of fear. But here's the problem: fear leaves traces, urgency, chaos, disorder, and the evidence shows none of that. The footprints were calm, deliberate, organized, as if they weren't fleeing, but choosing, which brings us to something more unsettling: a psychological factor, not panic, but influence. These men trusted each other. They relied on structure, guidance, routine. If one of them, especially someone more assertive, made a decision, the others may have followed without question, even if that decision was wrong, even if it led into danger. This theory suggests there was no external force, no threat, just a chain reaction of misplaced trust. One decision leading to another until they were too far in to turn back. And for many, this is the most reasonable explanation, because it doesn't require anything unknown, just human error. But even this doesn't fully explain the evidence, because once they reached the trailer, once survival was possible, why didn't they act accordingly? Why not use the heater? Why not consume all available food? Why not leave when they still could? It's as if their decision-making remained impaired, even when safety was within reach. And that's where the theories begin to shift, from plausible to something more difficult to define. Some have suggested the presence of an external actor, another person, someone who encountered them on the road, redirected them, influenced their path. But there's no solid evidence of this, no additional footprints, no signs of confrontation, no indication that anyone else was there. And yet, the idea persists, because without it, some of the decisions feel impossible. And then there are the theories that move even further beyond logic, beyond evidence, into the realm of the unknown. Some believe they encountered something in those mountains, not a person, not an animal, something else, a presence, a force, something that altered their behavior without leaving a trace, guiding them, disorienting them, keeping them moving in the wrong direction. These theories are difficult to prove, but they exist because the evidence allows space for them, because it doesn't close the door. It leaves it slightly open, and when a case leaves gaps, the mind fills them, sometimes with logic, sometimes with fear. In the end, every theory circles the same questions. Why leave the car? Why walk into the cold? Why ignore survival when it was within reach? And perhaps the most unsettling realization of all is that none of the answers fully resolve the contradictions. Not completely, not cleanly, which means something is missing, something we don't see, something we may never understand, because this isn't just a mystery with no answer. It's a mystery where every answer feels incomplete, and that's what makes it linger. Not the cold, not the distance, but the absence of certainty. Next, the echo that remains. What this case leaves behind long after the snow has settled. Some stories end with answers. This one doesn't. The mountains are quiet again. The road unchanged. Snow falls. Wind moves through the trees, and nothing remains except the absence of 5 men. Time has passed. Years, decades. The case has been examined, reopened, reconsidered, but it has never been resolved, because resolution requires something simple, a clear chain of cause and effect, and this case refuses to provide one. They were real people, not characters in a story, not symbols of a mystery. They had routines, habits, families who knew them, people who expected them to come home. And that's what makes this echo so heavy, because whatever happened interrupted something ordinary, something stable, and replaced it with something we still don't understand. There's a tendency to look at mysteries like this and search for something extraordinary, something dramatic. But sometimes the most unsettling possibility is something quieter, something internal, a chain of small decisions that, when combined, lead somewhere irreversible. 5 men step out of a car. They walk. They continue. And at no point does anyone turn back. Not completely. Not decisively. That's the detail that lingers, because turning back would have changed everything. But they didn't, and we don't know why. Inside the trailer, time stretched. At least one of them survived long enough to feel the cold settle in, long enough to realize where they were, long enough to understand something had gone wrong. and still. The choices made inside that space never fully align with survival. Not completely, not in a way we can follow. It's as if something remained unfinished, a thought interrupted, a decision delayed, an action never taken. And that's where the case lingers, not in what we see, but in what's missing, because the environment explains part of it. The cold, the distance, the isolation, those are real, measurable, understandable, but they don't explain the beginning. They don't explain the choice. Why leave the car? Why walk into the night? Why move deeper when everything says to stop? There is a moment in every mystery where something shifts, a single decision, a single influence, a single unknown variable that changes everything that follows. In this case, that moment is invisible. We don't see it. We don't hear it. We only see what came after. And what came after doesn't behave the way it should. That's why it stays. That's why it echoes. Because it resists closure. It leaves behind questions without anchors, the kind that don't fade, the kind that return quietly over time. And maybe that's what makes this case different. Not just the tragedy, not just the mystery, but the feeling that something essential is missing, something small but critical, a detail, a moment, a reason. And without it, everything else becomes uncertain. The car remains where it was found, in photographs, in records, in memory, a fixed point in a story that refuses to settle. And beyond it, the path, still leading forward, still unanswered. 5 men walked into the mountains, and whatever they encountered went with them. We are left with fragments, clues without resolution, a timeline without meaning, and a question that has no final shape. What happened on that road that night? No conclusion, only the echo